Unit 7, Global Conflict After 1900. Unit 7, Subunit 1, Shifting Power. In 1918, Nicholas II, the Russian Tsar, was assassinated during an intense period of rebellion that continued. In the 20th century, in the first 2 decades, rebellions erupted against long-standing authoritative governments such as China, Russia, and Mexico. These revolutions unseated ruling governments in their own country, which challenged political and social order, and instituted their own political philosophies and practices. This also established land-based and maritime empires that collapsed under pressure from internal and external forces. By the 1900s, Russia was falling behind most of Europe, the United States, and even Japan in wealth. The challenges were internal. Governments in the other industrialized states were active, promoting economic growth. However, Russia was not. It was slowly expanding in education for peasants. They built roads and other transportation networks that supported entrepreneurs with loans and contracts. The government resisted political reform and was reluctant to recognize civil liberties and allow citizens to participate in the government. This led to more external problems, such as the loss in the Crimean War against the Ottoman Empire and the loss in the Russo-Japanese War in a battle of power for Asia. In 1917, the Bolsheviks, which was an organization that represented the revolutionary working class of Russia under leadership of Vladimir Lenin, seized power and set up a communist government. They believed in communism, which meant that production and collective ownership would lead to a collective prosperity and a just society. Important events that led to Russia's revolution was Bloody Sunday, in which thousands of workers marched peacefully to petition against the Tsar, and the police began shooting, in which 1,300 marchers were killed. The Revolution of 1905, in which, in response to Bloody Sunday, 400,000 workers refused to work. The Tsar tried to appease the protesters. However, by the end, thousands of workers had been killed, injured, or exiled. The Russo-Japanese War and World War I were two external events that led to the revolution. Dr. Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Chinese government in 1911, creating a republic. This republic had internal challenges in which the Qing dynasty was never formally accepted by the Chinese people, which the Qing ruled for over 2 centuries, but they also remained ethnically diverse. The second problem was the constant danger of famine. China had a large amount of land and food supply. However, they could not keep up with the rapid population growth, and any natural disaster, such as a drought or flood, could cause thousands of deaths. The third was the government revenues were very low. Compared to Europe and the US, taxes in China were very low, meaning government buildings such as roads, bridges, and irrigation canals could not be maintained. An external challenge of China was they're looking down upon the European as less civilized and violent, which led to a lack of buying from the Chinese. The Sun Yat-sen believed that China should continue under Confucian principles and follow social harmony, so he combined them into three people's principles: democracy, nationalism, and livelihood. Sun Yat-sen's legacy was very short-lived. After 2 months in office, he gave up his position to a military leader. By this time, the Ottoman Empire became the sick man of Europe. They had very few exports and a waning agricultural economy. The Young Turks emerged as prosperity declined, and a group of reformers known as the Young Turks. They advocated for a constitution like European states and Turkification, which was an effort to make all citizens of the multi-ethnic empire identify with Turkish Empire, which was also heavily Islamic. Armenians, who were in the millions in this empire, found this difficult. In response, some Young Turks scapegoated or unfairly blamed the Armenians for the empire's economic problems. The Turks resented many Europeans, particularly the British and the French, for their economic policies. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled by the victorious powers and was placed in smaller nation-states, such as the Republic of Turkey and other independent countries. These areas were occupied by Allied forces and meant that they were puppets for the British forces and controlled the land of the former empire. A group of Turkish national movement people organized an army to fight for the self-determination of Turkey. This was led by Mustafa Kemal, who was part of these nationalists that defeated the British forces in 1912. The Republic of Turkey was established in 1923. Kemal became the first president, and his surname was Ataturk. His policies focused on reforming Turkey to make it more like Western democracies, and to create a secular nation, not one of strong Islamic influences. He implemented several reforms such as public education for both boys and girls, abolishing monogamy, and expanding suffrage to include women. He wore mainly Western suits and hats and looked like a Western man, perchance. And he did not give up power before his death in 1938. In Mexico, which was an independent nation firmly under the control of a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who saw stability and economic progress, but did not allow foreign investors, such as the United States, to have any control over the resources of Mexico. The 1% of the population controlled 97% of the land, meaning most Mexicans were landless. Diaz in 1910 was jailed during a revolution in which Francisco Madero, his opposition for president, grew in power and ignited the Mexican Revolution. Madero escaped and set up revolutionary offices in El Paso, Texas. Then, under the command of Francisco Pancho Villa, defeated Mexican troops. Mexico adopted a new constitution in 1917 that included the goals of land redistribution, universal suffrage, and public education. The PRI was formed in 1929 and was a corrupt party that dominated Mexican politics until 2000.
Subunit 2, Unit 7, Causes of World War I. In the years before World War I, social and political developments, including shifting powers, contributed to the escalation of tensions that resulted in global conflict. European nations expanding their empires competed for raw material resources in Africa and Asia. A series of mutual alliances created entanglements that committed nations to defense systems that would draw them into war. Arms races involving Germany, Great Britain, and Russia gave military establishments great influence. The immediate cause of the war's outbreak had its roots in another cause of conflict, a rising wave of nationalism. As Bismarck predicted, this clash erupted in the Balkans when Serbian nationalists, protecting Austria-Hungary's control over the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina, assassinated Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and World War I began. The person that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on June 28th, 1914, was a Serbian and a member of the Black Hand, which is a national organization devoted to ending Austro-Hungarian presence in the Balkans from Austro-Hungarian perspective. However, the Black Hand was a terrorist group, and they were being protected by the government of the country, so they weren't allowing the people to investigate this terrorist group. Now I'm going to discuss the long-term causes of this Great War. Tensions in Europe has been simmering for decades at this point, and a way to remember this is with the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, which is for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarism was defined as aggressive military preparedness, so they were like competing with each other to get the most like guns and missiles and tanks and stuff. And then there was alliances, and European nations formed secret alliances with other nations so they could protect themselves, but this ended up like furthering the war because then like they were getting stronger, so then it made the war a bigger deal. Some examples of this alliance was the Triple Alliance, which was the Allies. The Triple Alliance composed of Germany. No, that's not the Allies. Triple Alliance composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And then let's move on. Then there's imperialism. The alliance system developed largely because Western European countries became bitter rivals for global domination. This was to assert their power and generate wealth from overseas colonies. And finally, nationalism. The assassination of Archduke on June 1914 was the immediate cause of war, as I've stated earlier. It illustrates the growth of nationalism, and like people cared a lot of their Archduke, so they rose up in unison, so they could protect their nation. Therefore, nationalism. Their glorious king, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Some consequences of the Great War was new technologies made World War I the deadliest and most destructive war in human history. It disrupted European economies and had profound social consequences, including the rise of communism and fascism, colonial revolts, and genocide. There was a massive shift in power from Europe to the United States. Germany was furious about the terms about the peace treaty. Germany was forced to take full blame for the war, although Austria-Hungary started it, and forced to agree to make reparations, and possibly large payments to its opponents to make up for their losses. The war that was to make the world safe for democracy instead gave rise to authoritarian regimes and an even greater world war, aka World War II.
Unit 7, Subunit 3, Conducting World War I. At the start of World War I, Britain was the only major power going into the war without a universal conscription, which meant compulsory enlistment in the armed forces. Realizing patriotism could be contagious, meaning it can spread, they began to recruit Paul battalions, which was made up of men who already knew each other. By the end of the war, one of every 4 British men had already served in the military. Hundreds of thousands of teenage boys started to enthusiastically enlist in the military, dreaming of heroism. At the time, people had no idea how brutal this warfare could be. As it dragged on, people became aware of the horrific events, new advances of technology, such as trench warfare, which was long ditches which were dug into the ground, excavated earth, and banked in order to defend against the enemy fire. Combatants dug hundreds of miles of trenches that faced one another, slept, ate, fought, lived in these trenches for months at a time, which were cold, muddy, rat-infested. Unhygienic disease such as waterfoot and such were given to these soldiers. Poison gas was also used during World War I and had extremely painful and long-lasting effects that damaged veterans permanently. International treaties outlawed the use of poison gas. In 1800, machine guns were invented that could fire more than 500 rounds of ammunition. Submarines were used briefly in American Civil War, but they played a much bigger part in World War I. Airplanes were light, small, and used to spy. Individual air races would engage in dogfights with enemy aircraft. The British developed tanks that protected troops and moved across vast areas and even terrains. Both sides using such brutal weapons that it caused a bloody 4-year stalemate, which increased the death toll and suffering. The U.S. entering the war had economic ties with allies and had a few reasons to enter the war. The resentment against Germans for the U-boat submarine attacks carrying civilians, such as the Lusitania, which was an ocean liner carrying more than 100 U.S. citizens among its passengers, was sunk. The Zimmermann telegram in 1917 was a German document offered to help Mexico reclaim lost territory to the U.S., which the U.S. saw as a direct attack on their democracy. Total war was the idea of nations using all of their resources to a war effort, meaning that the domestic population, military, and everyone else, including women, were all committed to winning the war. Workers imported from China helped make labor shortages in Britain, France, and Russia. Entire economies were centered on winning the war. Propaganda was used as another component of total war. This influenced the attitudes and opinions of the community around a particular subject by spreading inaccurate or slanted information. Most governments heavily relied on this for Navy and Army recruitment. Those types of posters and propaganda was highly emotional, and no war since the 7 Years' War had been on such a global scale, in which most combatants in World War I ruled in colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and Pacific, and competition for these colonies was another major reason of the war. Imperialism extended the boundaries of the war, and major battles were fought in North Africa, Middle East, and even Japan. The British seized most of the German colonies in Africa. However, Germany held on to German East Africa called Tanzania, and which the British defended the Suez Canal from the Ottoman Empire. Colonial troops reinforced their home countries. About 500,000 Australians and New Zealanders enlisted to fight in the war. These troops were known as the Anzac and fought in a bloody year-long campaign at Gallipoli, which was northwestern of Turkey. Women played a very important role in World War I. They began replacing men in factories, served in combat, and was a major component in fighting the war. Damaging Europe, the war eventually came to an end in which a peace conference was held that would have profound effects on the entire world. This became known as the Big Four at the Paris Peace Conference, which had Woodrow Wilson from the U.S., David Lloyd George from Great Britain, George Clemenceau from France, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. The Big Four had different visions on how to settle the peace. Wilson pledged to establish peace without victory, in which no country should be severely punished or greatly rewarded. France rejected this view, and he believed that out of all the allies, France had suffered most and deserved special treatment. Wilson created the 14 points, despite France's protests. That was a 14-point plan on how to handle the war. He also dreamed of a League of Nations, in which the U.S. Senate later voted against joining and against ratifying in the Treaty of Versailles in 1912, which was a peace Germany for the end of World War I. And Woodrow Wilson also believed that the people who were conquered by the Central Powers deserved the right to self-determination and to decide their own political futures. Woodrow Wilson failed to convince France and Britain not to punish Germany, and thus Germany was treated harshly. They had to pay billions of dollars in reparations, restrict the size of their armed forces, give up all their economies, and were blamed for the entire war. This was humiliating. This took a tremendous hardship on the nation, and the economy suffered. This resentment from the Weimar Republic would later lead to the Nazis in World War II.
Subunit 4. Economy in the interwar period. Not long after the global trauma of World War I, a global economic crisis resulted in the Great Depression of the 1930s and eventually led to World War wealth as imperialism spread As unemployment, hunger, and homelessness increased, people turned to their governments for help. Governments had long been essential to capitalism, building roads, providing schools, and regulating trade. But across the world in the 1930s, government intervention in the economy increased. The United States became more liberal as President Roosevelt identified inequalities and activities that undermined the economy and could lead to war. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay billions of dollars in reparations to the war's victors. War-ravaged Germany could not make these payments, so its government printed more paper money in the 1920s. The action caused inflation, a general rise in prices. Inflation meant the value of German money decreased drastically. To add to the sluggish post-war economy, France and Britain had difficulty repaying wartime loans from the United States, partly because Germany was having trouble paying reparations to them. In addition, the Soviet government refused to pay Russia's pre-revolutionary debts. Although the 1920s brought modest economic gains for most of Europe, the subsequent Great Depression ended the most tentative stability. Agricultural overproduction and the United States stock market crash in 1929 were two major causes of the global economic downturn. The global production and the total global trade decreased from 1929 to 1932, and then it gradually increased from 1933 to 1938. The New Deal. The administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt used Keynes' ideas to address the Great Depression in the United States. Keynes' ideas were governments should use deficit spending more than the government takes in, to stimulate economic activity. By cutting taxes and increasing spending, governments would spur economic growth. People would return to work and depression would end. Now I'm going to talk about the impact on trade. The Great Depression was a global event. Though it started in the industrialized countries of the United States and Europe, it spread to Latin America, Africa, and Asia. By 1932, more than 30 million people worldwide were out of work. People everywhere turned to their governments for help. As unemployment increased, internal trade declined. A decline made worse as nations then imposed strict tariffs or taxes on imports in an effort to protect domestic jobs they still had. Now I will discuss Russia. There's a continuing revolution in Russia. Although Lenin and the Bolshevik Party had promised peace, land, and bread, that is not what they provided. There was a Russian Civil War in 1918 to 1921, and Russians and Ukrainians revolted against the Russian government's actions. By 1921, Lenin realized the Russian economy was near complete collapse. So he had a new economic plan. He reintroduced private trade, allowing farmers to sell their products on a small scale. The new economic plan enjoyed modest success, but it came to an end when Lenin died in 1924. Then, after Lenin, Joseph Stalin happened, and he instituted the 5-year plan that was meant to transform the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR, into an industrial power. He collectivized agriculture, which took the land from private owners and gave it to collectives to manage the land. And he also gave, he needed people to get a certain amount of food or they would be punished. So they need to, work harder. The government would seize food to send to cities, and the farmers retaliated against the collectivization by burning crops and killing livestock. Many moved to cities for better life. A series of 5-year plans had mixed results. The collectivization of agriculture was a huge failure. Millions of peasants starved to death, especially in Ukraine. However, heavy industry grew tremendously in the 1930s. Consumer goods were in short supply. There was plenty of factory jobs available, and the cost of living was low. A new political system known as fascism was the rise of right-wing governments arose, and it appealed to extreme nationalism, glorified the military in armed struggle, and blamed problems on ethnic minorities. Fascist regimes suppressed other political parties, protests, and independent trade unions. They justified violence to achieve their goals and were strongly anti-communist. Germany turned to fascism, and some other countries did as well. An example of fascism was in Italy with Benito Mussolini. Italy was one of the victors of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, along with Britain, France, and the United States, but they received very little territory from the Treaty of Versailles. This failure caused discontent in Italy, and there was extreme bitterness. So the fascist party started in Italy. Another example of fascism was Francisco Franco in Spain. He led the insurgents who called themselves nationalists. On the other side were Republicans or Loyalists, the defenders of the new elected Spanish Republic. Franco won a civil war against these Loyalists in 1936 to 1939. It ended when his forces defeated the Loyalists. He ruled Spain as a dictator until his death in 1975. Spain did not officially enter World War II, 1939 to 1945, but the government offered some help to Germany, Italy, and Japan.
Unit 7, Subunit 5, Unresolved Tensions After World War I. Many disputes and issues were left unresolved after World War I. The victors in the war, European powers and Japan, kept control over the colonies or expanded. However, anti-imperial resistance was growing throughout Asia and Africa. Looking back, the spread of nationalism in these regions was part of the same global trend that followed the breakup of empires in Europe. The success of communism in Russia and anti-immigrant sentiments in the U.S. were example of Turkey's push for self-determination that was already discussed. The effect of World War One was various throughout the world, in which U.S. began to prosper and European countries suffered the greatest damage and devastated these nations. While nationalist movements had been brewing for decades in South Africa, South Asia, and West Africa, the war renewed hopes for these peoples in these regions for independence. Africa and Asian colonial troops contributed thousands of soldiers to the Allied war effort. German propaganda during World War I had predicted the colonial soldiers' experience in the war that would lead to uprising colonial rebellion. However, this did not materialize, but there were several local rebellions. The decolonization process was started after people and nationalists saw Wilson's 14 points and hoped that bloodshed for their home country would earn them some respect from the Western Europe. The big three of David Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, and George Clemenceau were not interested in freeing these colonies. They granted self-determination only to white countries in Eastern Europe. Middle Eastern lands that had already been part of the Ottoman Empire came under the control of France and Britain in the League of Nations mandate system. Former German colonies in Africa had the same fate. Wilson refused to meet up with Vietnamese nationalists, including a young Ho Chi Minh, who asked to speak to him about self-determination. This rejection fueled stronger hatred and determination for nationalists. The mandate system was established to rule the colonies into territories of the Central Powers, and stated that colonized people in Africa and Asia required tutelage from more advanced nations in order to survive. This was to increase their imperial holdings through a new form of colonization. This infuriated Arabs who lived in these lands and set the stage for a national movement called Pan-Arabism. It was an ideology that called for the unification of all lands in North Africa and the Middle East. Another source of conflict came up in 1917, where the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which stated that Palestine should become a permanent home for Jews of Europe. These people who supported the Jewish homeland were known as Zionists. And after the victory in the Great War, European Jews moved into droves to Palestine, which Britain did control at the time. In South Asia, the Indian National Congress formed in the 1900s was to air grievances by the colonial government. It became a strong voice of independence. Gandhi, in the 1920s, also known as Mohandas Gandhi, started a satyagraha movement in which he showed civil disobedience that encouraged Indians to break unjust laws and serve jail time. These were in an effort to free India from British colonial rule. The Salt March, one of Gandhi's first campaigns, was to rebel against the illegal production of sea salt, which the Indians had, and it was easy to make, but Britain wanted a monopoly on the salt. Gandhi led thousands of Indians to the Arabian Sea and picked up a few grains of salt in defiance of Britain's unjust policies. The CCP, or Chinese Communist Party, was founded in 1921, which was led eventually by Mao Zedong, the son of a prosperous peasant. Mao believed that the Chinese Communist Revolution could only be based on the result of peasants who made up the vast majority of the Chinese population. The National Party, or Kuomintang, was led by Sun Yat-sen, who was devoted to full independence of China. After his death, Chiang Kai-shek took control of the National Party and was a conservative who had a deep-seated distrust of communists. His forces annihilated Mao's forces, initiating the Chinese Civil War. The Long March was a retreat into Chinese territories where for several years they trained in hiding. Mao's forces began the Long March, a year-long, 6,000-mile-long retreat. It traversed treacherous mountains, deep marshes, and extremely dry deserts. The Communist Party was weak after the Long March. However, peasants did admire Mao for his tremendous stamina and commitment to their ideals. This support would lead to the winning of communists and control of the country. China, Japan, and Manchukuo in 1913. The nationalist communists in China suspended their civil war to unite against more persisting danger, Japan. Japan had invaded Manchuria in northern China in 1931. This increased tensions. When the League of Nations condemned Japan's action in Manchuria, Japan gave up its membership in the League and seized more land. In 1932, Japan set up a puppet state called Manchukuo. This seemed more independent, like the Chinese state. However, Japan continued to expand its empire until 1945 of World War II, where it seized the Philippines and numerous Pacific islands. They claimed to be liberating people from Western imperialism, but they saw Japan as a conqueror. In South Asia, people all over Africa, just like South Asia, people all over Africa were disappointed in their colonies when they did not achieve independence after World War I. The leaders of Africa independence movements were educated in Europe, such as Jomo Kenyatta, who was in London, and Leopold Senghor, who was the future leader of Senegal, studied in Paris. Most members of the educated elite worked for the colonial government, and Africans under colonial rule resisted the colonizers.
Subunit 6. Causes of World War II. A major cause of World War II was Hitler. No, he wasn't the main cause. It was the economic state of Germany that caused Hitler to arise, and his failure in art school. His extreme views on the superiority of the Aryan race, which is white Christian people that have blonde hair and blue eyes, and he had neither, but he still says they're superior. And he also had a vision of a great German civilization that led him to persecute Jews and other minorities and to systematically seize land. Rise of Nazism. Following Germany's defeat in 1918, the democratically elected Weimar Republic replaced the monarchical rule of the Kaiser. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the new German government not only had to pay billions in war reparations, but also had not allowed to have an army. The Weimar Republic, appearing weak to the demoralized German people, became especially unpopular during the Great Depression. So the people looked to right-wing political parties that promised strong action. Hitler was anti-Semitist, which means he hated Jewish people. But not only did he hate Jewish people, he hated Slavs, communists, and gay men and women. Hitler suggested that the only way for Germany to live up to its potential was to eliminate the corrupting influence of these groups, particularly the Jewish. Nuremberg laws were Hitler's anti-Jewish campaign and were designed to disenfranchise and discriminate against them, and they were passed in 1935. It forbade the marriage between Jews, and it took away their citizenship away from the Jews. Axis powers then sought new allies to help them acquire the new German Empire. They made a pact with fascist Italy. Nazi Germany had aggressive militarism, even though the terms of the Treaty of Versailles severely limited the German military after World War I, but he wanted a stronger military, so he broke the treaty in March 1935. Both France and Britain protested his move into Rhineland, but they took no action, which they should have. Britain followed a policy of appeasement, giving in to Germany's demands in hopes of keeping peace. However, Germany's military expansion and its support of the fascist Spanish nationalist government during the Spanish Civil War 1936 to 1939 indicated that Hitler was increasing his power. German-Austrian unification. With his military revived and alliances in hand, Hitler felt confident in taking the next step of creating a new German empire. The Third Reich, his plan to bring Austria, which he was born in, under the German rule. Hitler used the threat of invasion to pressure the Austrian Chancellor into giving more power to the Austrian Nazi Party. As Hitler had planned, the Austrian Nazis then opened the door for German troops to occupy Austria with no resistance. Germany had signed a German-Soviet non-aggression pact on August 23rd, 1939, that they had pledged to not attack one another. But then Hitler defied this pact and stabbed them in the back. Then there's Japan's expansion in Asia. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Japan had already been moving aggressively against Korea and China for 50 years.
Unit 7, Subunit 7, Conducting World War II. Governments relied all their resources in world effort. This was called intense nationalism that was illustrated by Winston Churchill's speech that was a part of concreted policies that use all forms of communication to mobilize the population. Governments used new military technology and tactics that included atomic bomb and total war that disregarded previous accepted laws of war. These increased the level of wartime casualties. Japan imperialist policies. The occupation of parts of China was but only one step in Japan's overall strategy. They wanted to create a new order in China, in East Asia, that looked to expand into Soviet Siberia. But when Germany and the Soviets signed the Non-Aggression Pact, Japan was forced to look elsewhere for new territory. Japan faced obstacles. Its occupation of China led to economic sanctions by the U.S. They relied on oil and scrap iron from the United States. These sanctions threatened to strangle Japan's economy and undercut its military expansion. Japan began to retaliate against the U.S. with its military forces, and they hoped it would submit to their ambitions. Hitler moved swiftly, tactfully, and gloriously on a strategy called the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. They quickly subdued Poland. Using tanks, it did a 4-week campaign, and at the end of September 1939, Soviets divided the country as planned, and they signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This rapid success encouraged Hitler to attack and conquer Denmark and Norway in 1940. The French set up a new pro-Nazi regime based in Vichy under Marshal Henry Philippe Pétain, an aged World War I hero. Fearing that it would be the next victim in Germany's relentless campaign, Britain asked the U.S. for support. Despite its long history of isolationism, the European troubles, President Roosevelt believed the U.S. should help the British. The two powers signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, in which the U.S. promised delivery of 50 destroyers in exchange for 8 British air and naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. The Lend-Lease Act gave up all pretensions of neutrality and lended imperialist Britain. The Atlantic Charter set down basic goals for the post-World War and provisions of restoration of self-government. Hitler ordered a large campaign against the small island nation of Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He believed the bombardment from the air would sufficiently weaken the country so that the German sea and land force could mount a successful invasion. The Germans turned towards bombing British cities after the British Royal Air Force conducted a raid on Berlin. Churchill termed this Britain's finest hour. After failing to invade Britain, Hitler turned to the east. He attacked the Soviet Union, double-crossing Stalin and the Non-Aggression Pact, in hoping to eliminate Bolshevism and create Leibnizarism, which land developments for settlement and development for the German people. However, the German forces would soon find themselves at the mercy of the harsh Russian winter. Leningrad was defended, which lasted 3 years and led to the death of millions of Soviet men, women, and children. The victories in the Pacific by Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Japan believed that this surprise attack would damage the U.S. so harshly that it would prompt the U.S. to negotiate a settlement favorable to Japan. Instead, the U.S. responded harshly. The colonial armies, as the Axis powers expanded into new territory, Western colonies began to join allies in this war effort. It started at 200,000 men, but gained up to 2.5 million men. In the European theater, in 1942, the Allies were struggling in Europe and North Africa. General Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox, led German troops in Egypt and threatened to take northern city of Alexandria. However, in the second half, the tide turned against the British defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein, and after months of fighting, the Soviet counter-offensive successfully defeated the pride of Hitler's military in the Battle of Stalingrad. In the Pacific Theater, the first Allied victory occurred in May in the Battle of the Coral Sea, in which the U.S. Navy stopped a Japanese fleet to invade New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. This helped prevent a future invasion of Australia. The Allied forces in the Pacific under the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur used a strategy called island hopping, in which the Allies attacked island by island where Japan was weak and skipped those where Japan was strong. Allies slowly and at great human cost moved through the Philippines, getting closer to Japan itself. Aircraft carriers allowed planes to take off from and land on their decks at sea, that provided air support for battleships and increased the range of flexibility of naval forces. In the last years of the war, the Allies identified Italy as the weakest point under Axis control in Europe. German forces sent aid to Italy, and the Allies gained control of the island of Sicily in July of 1943. After the fall of Mussolini, Italy was a mess. In June 1944, D-Day started, in which 150,000 U.S. and Allied troops, under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower, launched an invasion on the beaches of Normandy, in northern France, which was occupied by the Nazi Germans. The Germans made one final push against the Allies during the winter of 1944, called the Battle of Bulge, which was fought in the Ardemis Forest across parts of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This victory left Germany with unrealistic expectations of winning the war, yet Hitler refused to give up. Hitler spent his final days hiding in a bunker fortified in an underground shell. Hitler committed suicide. His ally Mussolini had been killed, and Japan captured the islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima and prepared to attack the Japanese mainland. U.S. troops firebombed Tokyo, killing about 100,000 people. Atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which after Nagasaki, the Japanese surrendered, giving in. World War II was the bloodiest war in human history and resulted in the deaths of around 75 million people. 2/3 were civilians. It provided an ideological battle between the U.S. and Soviet, which would shape the affairs of the next 5 decades in the Cold War.
Subunit 8, Mass Atrocities. Ethnic atrocities did not end after World War II. Dictator Pol Pot wanted to purify Cambodian society using racial, social, and political lines, resulting in deaths of 1.6 to 1.8 million Cambodians. And in Rwanda, the majority of Hutu government directed mass slaughter in the Tutsi minority. Many people died. Between 8.8 million and 9 million soldiers died in the war. In World War II, and 21 million wounded. In France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, fewer than half of all young men who fought for their countries returned physically unharmed. Soldiers who did return often bore emotional scars. Civilian casualties were 6 million to 13 million. Armenian genocide. Deaths were between 600,000 and 1.5 million of Armenians in Turkey, and they aren't even saying that this happened, and they are using propaganda to say that it's not real and it's illegal to talk about it. There was a famine in Ukraine. In the Soviet Union, peasants strongly resisted Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. They hid or destroyed their crops and killed their livestock rather than turning them over to state control. This led to famines from human action rather than by weather or crop failures. The famines in 1932 and 1933 were devastating. An estimated 7 million to 10 million peasants died as a result. Lots of people were killed in World War II as well. 40 million to 50 million. Half of those were citizens of Soviet Union, and many were from Germany, Poland, China, and Japan. Deaths in the U.S. were fewer. 290,000 soldiers were killed and 600,000 wounded. A large reason why there's so many deaths was because of Hitler's final solution, which was the Holocaust, which killed people in gas chambers. The Japanese, during the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, Japanese soldiers killed at least 100,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians in what was called the Rape of Nanking. Then there was the firebombing in Hamburg of 1943 and Dresden in 1945. The deaths in Hamburg were 50,000, and Dresden there was 25,000.
Unit 7, Subunit 9, Causation in Global Conflict. World War I was the first total war in which the war was fought on an industrial scale by soldiers all around the world. They used more deadly and more efficient ways of killing each other, such as long-range artillery, poison gas, flamethrowers, machine guns, which led to the death of millions of soldiers. The balance of Europe was constantly shifting through alliances. Nationalism was a force for political change in Europe. The Balkans were known as the powder keg of Europe. Some of the same issues that brought about World War I also led to World War II. Fascism, which was an extreme form of nationalism, rose. The alliance of Germany, Italy, and eventually Japan was opposed by the Western democracies of Great Britain and France. The economic cause of global conflict in the 20th century was the acquisition and control of markets and resources. The Industrial Revolution spread from Great Britain to the rest of Western Europe, and then the US, Russia, and Japan, which control over market to sell consumer goods was a primary motive of these imperialistic policies. The first and second Sino-Japanese War, the Crimean War, and the two World Wars have their root causes, such in imperialism and The rapid advances in science and technology led to better areas in communication, transportation, industrial, agriculture, and medicine. Warfare became deadlier, and deadly policies that targeted specific minority groups like Jews, and the use of the new military technology like the atomic bomb meant that global conflict would cause much more deaths than before. Germany resented the Treaty of Versailles, which brought about the totalitarian regimes in Germany and Italy, which led to World War II. World War One weakened the colonial powers after the U.S. Wilson Woodrow advocated for self-determination and for people to determine their own government / nation state. India took a large independence movement in 1947 due to Mahatma Gandhi, and it was partitioned into Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India, and now Bangladesh on East Pakistan.